Hi, welcome to That's Jacqueline. Today I have my friend and author Harvey J. Kaye on today to talk about his book, Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again. Welcome, Harvey.
It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. So since we last met, you've written this new book.
Right?
We've interviewed you on the other book that you had, which was Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, correct?
Right. And did we talk about the fight for the four freedoms? What made FDR and the greatest generation
Yeah,
true?
that's true. I think we did do the fight for the four freedoms, and then we had another interview that we had an issue with. So yes, good
Oh, right.
reminder.
That's right.
Um, so a lot has happened since then. I've been going over. We post some questions to the audience to kind of see what they would like to know from you. Some of them are kind of general, but I thought I'd kind of go over some of those and get your answers for those first, and then we could kind of dive deeper into the book. So from Jennifer, we've got, who are you most inspired by?
Okay. So generally speaking, I'm usually inspired by people of the past. People in the present I might admire, but I don't know if I'm actually inspired by anyone in the present so much as I admire them. But out of the past, the people that really inspire me, I think my foremost hero is Thomas Paine Thomas Paine, right? The American revolutionary, the author of Common Sense, the man who in 1776 called for an American revolution, or the idea of turning the American rebellion against Britain into a revolution, not only for independence, but for the making of a democratic republic. And I think what I really find inspiring is not just that he had that idea and that vision, but the way in which he wrote. So we often think of writers such as Thomas Paine as geniuses. And I think the word genius is always a dangerous thing. I think we should think of them as just incredibly talented and maybe really important as small d democratic. Because when Paine wrote Common Sense, it wasn't that he just pulled ideas out of his head. It wasn't genius in that sense. It was that he was putting into words the kinds of things that he believed his new fellow Americans were themselves thinking, but had yet to say themselves. So what inspires me is a writer who can articulate the aspirations of a generation as effectively as Thomas Paine. So in many ways, I really constantly marvel at Thomas Paine. And I keep his writings very close by, and when I get a little low, I remember to read them, especially lines like, "These are the times that try men's souls from the crisis," or "We have it in our power to begin the world over again, which comes from common sense." Those kinds of things, they inspire me. Thomas Paine inspires me.
Oh, for sure. So you've kind of told me before in a previous interview, what inspired you to become a professor and a historian, but I thought it was really interesting, the story that you told about your grandfather and his books. Can you kind of, go back over that for
Yeah,
us?
well, my grandfather, my father's side, both of my grandfathers are really important in my growing up. But to refer to my father's father, it was regularly the case that he would come out, or he and my grandmother would come out to New Jersey from Brooklyn. And this was maybe at the age of 4, approaching 5, when I couldn't read yet. And he would read to me from Old Testament Bible stories. But he always turned the Bible stories into a story of not only a biblical past, but a kind of historical present. So he would weave together these Bible stories, which were always sort of presented to me as stories of descent and rebellion and liberation by way of Exodus and so on. But he also then wove them together with his own growing up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And his, probably best way to put it, is his days as a young socialist in New York. So I think in some ways it was the idea that past and present were linked together that really had a significant impact on me. And the other part of it is that as I got a bit older and I could read, and we would more often visit my grandparents because my grandmother had a series of illnesses and strokes. When I was at my grandparents' home, and to make the long story short, I would often wander their sizable apartment as if it was galleries of a museum. And I would always end up in the very same place, on the floor at the far end of the dining room, where my grandfather kept his personal books. He was an attorney, and his office was in Manhattan, so the law books were all there. But in his apartment, in the back corner, well, back end, you might say, of the dining room, he had these personal books. And on one particular shelf, which I always ended up sitting in front of and staring at, were books by and about Thomas Paine, to speak of Paine again. And one of the books, which to this day, I laugh because it was both very powerful in my childhood and also utterly wrong in its argument. This book argued that Thomas Paine, not Thomas Jefferson, was the real author of the Declaration. And I'll just say that I just loved the fact that this book proved that all my teachers were wrong about American history. It was really Thomas Paine.
Radical, and you
So,
really embraced that.
well, yeah, I mean, I would go in, and I don't think I ever got 100 on a history test whenever the revolution was a part of the question, because I always made this case for Thomas Paine. Now, as I got older, I realized in many ways, in diverse ways, that Thomas Paine was definitely not the author of the Declaration. Without Thomas Paine writing Common Sense and truly inspiring and encouraging Americans to turn themselves from rebels into revolutionaries, there would have been no Declaration. But if Paine had written the Declaration, I think in many ways it might have been even more radical. And I'll give you one prime example of something missing from the Declaration that if Paine had written it would have been there. Both Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson were deists. That is, they believed in God, but they didn't necessarily believe in the traditional Jewish or Christian God that could intervene in everyday life.
And I think that's important for us to know too, because we have, in God we trust on everything, and I think people, address that or assume that that means that it's a Christian God, right? In this country,
well, and as a deist,
misrepresented.
Yeah, and they were both deists, though Thomas Paine was a more militant deist, perhaps, than Jefferson. But Jefferson himself was clearly a deist. Neither one of them were members of any traditional church, even though Jefferson was viewed in many ways as an Anglican because of his family background. Well, in any case, if at the beginning of the Declaration, it's really important, there is a reference to the Creator. But it's very interesting that it's nature's or creator. It's a deist rendition of the creation, or deist rendition of God. But to go beyond that, Paine, in Common Sense, argued on the imperative of separating church and state in the new nation that Americans would create. He was the one who really made the argument that later Jefferson himself picks up on to talk about a wall between church and state. But the thing is, there's no specific reference beyond that original deist kind of reference to God. There's no reference there to the imperative of freedom of worship in the Declaration. If Paine had written it, I think that would have been built into it. So anyhow, that's just the historical reference.
Yeah, and that might have solved us a lot of problems, right? We could have said,
yes,
maybe,
I'll just point out for everyone to realize the Constitution is a godless constitution, which, by the way, I say as a compliment. There is absolutely no reference to God in the Constitution. The only reference to religion really is the fact that there should be no religious tests of anyone running for office, which is
that was one of the things that I really liked about the book.
And also the Bill of Rights, freedom of work. Sorry, I'm talking. I don't mean to talk over you. I'll just say, and also in the First Amendment, the basically no establishment of religion, no establishment of a church. So, and that's something that Paine himself spoke of first of all in Common Sense. And I'll also say that because he did, those who were not members of the dominant churches became themselves all the more eager to be a part of the revolution. And, I'm not taking anything away from Jefferson. The Declaration is a magnificent, magnificent revolutionary text. But Thomas Paine would have made it that much more radical, I think.
More simple. So you talk about that a lot in the book about, radical and what that means. I kind of pulled a few examples out of what, when I'm thinking of a radical, when you say radical, people automatically start to tense up. And in general, people think that it means, anarchy, right? They think that it means we're bombing the streets and we're going to, take the White House or what have you. But you've pointed out repetitively in not just this book, but in your other books and on Twitter, because I follow you there, that's not what radical means. So can you kind of explain what your definition of radical is?
Well, let me put it this way. I think my definition of radical 30 years ago probably was different than it would be today. And I'll explain why, and then I'll get to the point of your question. We have lived through 45 years of class war from above. 45 years in which corporate America has really waged war on working people, and they've rallied folks who are less interested in class war and more interested in culture war to their side. So all we've seen is decades in which working people's rights are under siege, in which women's rights are under siege, and in which people of color and even young people, students' rights are under siege when you think about the efforts to restrict voting. So if we think about these past 30 to 45 years as a war, not just on working people, women, and people of color, but a war against the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and the generation known as the greatest generation, which lived on beyond Roosevelt's age. I mean, the age of Roosevelt or the age of the greatest generation actually goes from the 1930s to the early 70s. And you think about the New Deal and the organizing of the 30s, and then the war effort. And then after that, you think about all the way to the 1960s with civil rights, voting rights, Medicare, Medicaid, environmental protection,
It's a
consumer
long
protection.
list, right? It's a
Right. I mean,
long
this is the generation that really left us incredible democratic achievements. And this class war of these past 40 to 45 years has been a war on those achievements to reduce Social Security, to take away things such as Medicare and Medicaid, to take away women's right to control their own body. I mean, on and on and on. So when I say radical, I mean in many ways both the classical sense of a radical, that is of going to the root of the matter, but also the sense of the progressive tradition in America. And in many ways, I think that the radical and the progressive and the social democratic and even the fighting liberal traditions are all bound up together as a kind of radical force. Because I think America from the beginning of 1776 had built into it, imbued in it, by way of Thomas Paine's common sense and Thomas Jefferson's Declaration, a radical imperative, even if so much was left undone, even if exploitation and oppression continued. The fact is that there was a radical imperative embodied in the promise of equality in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in the idea that we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And all the way through American history, we've seen generation upon generation of Americans, native born and newly arrived, pursuing that struggle for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to make real the idea of we the people, and to expand upon not only who is included in the people, but the very powers of the people. So when I say radical, I have in mind radical and progressive and truly liberal kinds of initiatives and achievements that right now we seem to have to defend, but also if we're going to live up to being Americans, we're going to have to build upon them. So yes, we have Social Security, but it's time for Medicare for all. Okay.
So, I mean, we are a radical nation. I mean, that's, I think that we've been sold this propaganda for the last 100 years to kind of put us in our place to say that we aren't. But really, I pulled out some examples out of your book. I mean, with Lincoln, taking on slavery, FDR taking on the Great Depression and adding on all these social programs, Martin Luther King taking on civil rights. These are all radical fights. We have, from the beginning of our origins of this country, we have been a radical nation, but we've been told that we're not. We've been told to sit and behave, and that radical is a bad thing. One of the other things I looked at when
let me just say something in addition to your references there, and that is that it's that too often we're actually taught just the great figures of history, such as George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt. But what we're failing to be taught, and this I think is really crucial. I was thinking about it this morning, that if Bernie Sanders and the progressive Democrats, if we can actually win in November 2020, we have to start thinking about how we might like to enhance American education, history teaching. And I think it's imperative that what we come to appreciate is how American working people themselves pushed Washington to actually join the revolution. I mean, Washington was leading a rebel army, but what led him to declare for independence was the fact that his own soldiers were reading common sense and declaring for independence. In Lincoln's case, what really enables him, because he hated slavery, but what finally enables him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation is that Black slaves in the South, once the Civil War begins, are running all the more quickly away from those plantations in hopes of reaching the Union lines and somehow serving the Union cause. Similarly with FDR, I mean, these are progressive figures to begin with, but even with Franklin Roosevelt, he had ambitions and aspirations to make America more radical. But what enables him to do it, and even pushes him beyond what he might have imagined, is that working people are organizing in unions.
He didn't want a mutiny on his hands. I mean, at some point you have to listen to the people. You don't want to have a mutiny on your hand. At some point,
Well,
Sometimes
he really did welcome the push from below. There's a famous story of Franklin Roosevelt and A.
maybe,
Philip Randolph, the great black labor leader and civil rights leader. And Randolph heard the Four Freedoms speech of January 1941, in which Roosevelt said, we look forward to a world beyond the war of freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And Randolph thought this was a prime opportunity to challenge Roosevelt to do something about integrating the workplace for the war industries, the defense industries. To make the long story short, Randolph organizes the March on Washington movement in 1941. And he announces confidently that they are going to bring 100,000 African Americans to Washington to demand racial justice and greater participation in the defense industries. Roosevelt tried to dissuade him, to get him to back off, and he sent Eleanor Roosevelt to try to do that for him. And eventually Roosevelt realized the only way he could sort of try to temper Randolph's enthusiasm was to meet him in the White House. And Randolph had been in the White House before, but he was invited to the White House that spring with the idea of trying to dissuade him from marching.
which
Why?
he did,
Because,
right?
well, this is important because Roosevelt wasn't afraid of African Americans marching. He was afraid of what white police and white citizens of Washington might do to the marchers because it was a segregated city. So, okay, Randolph comes to the White House accompanied by Walter White, who's the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And they're in the White House and they're schmoozing, and this is, Roosevelt's hoping to warm the conversation up. And eventually he's compelled to ask the question. So I understand you're going to bring a march to Washington. How many people are you planning on bringing?
How many are you counting on?
And Roosevelt expected to hear the number 100,000. Sorry, I blew the whole story. Randolph announced a march of 10,000 people. In the White House, when Roosevelt asked, Randolph answered 100,000. That's the punchline, okay? At that point, Roosevelt decides it's imperative for him to sign an executive order demanding the integration of the defense industries and the second order, creating a commission to oversee the implementation of the order. Now, it looks like he wouldn't have done this otherwise, you might say. But here's the thing. Randolph, after he leaves the White House, he either said it to Walter White or in a letter to a relative or friend, he said, I knew when I was going into the White House that I would get what I was there for. Okay? Because what Roosevelt did is Roosevelt had in mind this: I can't sign this executive order without suffering, the anger of certain political forces. But if I'm compelled to do it, then it will look like I had no choice.
Had no choice,
Okay?
yeah.
So Randolph knew he would never have been invited to the White House by Roosevelt if it wasn't the case that Roosevelt was prepared to do it, and that their moment in the White House was this critical moment that empowers Roosevelt to do it. And, sorry, I didn't mean to.
But
story.
You made a good point because, like the "Not Me, Us" movement with Bernie Sanders is really that. It's getting, not only is it putting power back into the people's hands, but it's allowing figures across lines even to make decisions that they normally would not maybe that would not be that popular either with their voters or with their co-conspirators.
Well, look, Bernie gets it. That's the point. And he knows his story of Roosevelt. He knows this, that no president can do everything. Right. However much Trump is doing all the shit he's doing, okay? Yeah. No president can do everything. And the fact is that you need to get legislation enacted and you need to make sure that you have the people behind you. So I remember back in 2016 when he was running in the primaries against Hillary, people, the likes of Anderson Cooper would say to Bernie, well, look, what if you don't have Congress? How are you going to make anything happen? And he said, that's when the American people are going to have to stand forth in support of and make demands upon Congress.
Well, we're supposed to be a partnership. That the whole premise of our government, this democracy or what republic, whatever, however you want to put it, is that it's a partnership. It's between the people and the leaders. It's supposed to be that. And I think somewhere along the lines, people either by without choice or with choice decided to allow the leaders to handle it. They know more than me. They understand better. They know how it works. We'll vote them into office, and then we'll sit back and we'll let them do their thing. And that letting them do their thing, whether it was forced or otherwise, has put us where we are. This
Well,
is why
it wasn't easy to get Americans to think that way. Two things had to happen. The first one was they had to constantly hear from the powers that be, basically, leave it to us. Don't worry. One. Two, given the ways in which people are having to work so many hours to make enough to live and to provide for a family, if you're working 10 hours a day, and you're working fewer hours but having to go from one job to the other, you're not going to have much time to stay on top of the questions of the day, and you're not going to have much time to get involved in public debate and in public discussions. And basically, if you go into a tavern, you might get into an argument with some of these discussions, right? So it's easy. In some ways, it's easy to say, well, we'll leave it to them. But
right.
and then you've got this other thing, that there were all too many Democratic leaders, including the likes of the Clintons, who really did not want it to be a partnership. I mean, Bill Clinton's presidency was top down.
It was
Okay,
trust me, I got this.
top down, number one. And Hillary Clinton, when she ran in 2016, it was terribly annoying and exasperating. She said, "I want to be your champion. I want to fight for you." Well, I don't want her to be my champion. I don't want Bernie to be my champion. I don't want him to fight for us only, where I should say, I don't want him only to fight for us. I wanted to encourage the fight in all of us. And
Yeah.
Bernie gets that, and that's why it's not me, us.
Exactly. So that's one of the things that I want to go back a little bit, but one of the things you talked about was, that one, you said it kind of twice, that no one president can do everything. And I this is kind of a belief that I have. I feel like that, you have somebody launch something and they do as much as they can, whether it's a president or a senator or what have you. And then, there's always a step two. There always needs to be a step two. So one of the notes when I was reading through your book, because it kind of, it reminded me of that, is I made is, that just that we've been called on to fight battles that we thought we've won, right? People think that they've won. We think that these are some of the examples that came to mind as I was reading your book. We thought we won against slavery, but we still had to go for civil rights, right? We didn't achieve equality just by making people free. There were things that there was another step to that. We thought we had women's rights. Women had right to vote and they had a right to work and all of that, but we still needed the ERA. We still needed that to be passed to solidify it. I remember the day that I recognized that, when I started to really think about it, that, yeah, I'm not as free as I think I am. I'm not as equal as I think I am. And I was like, how did I not know this? And I'm, obviously a little bit more liberally minded, but I still was like, wow, that's a thing. Another thing with
Well, hold
with
on,
the
hold on.
depression.
I want to respond to that, because
Sure.
there's a line I love to quote. I'm sure you saw it at least once in
Absolutely.
the book, maybe more. This line from here it is. Henry Demarest Lloyd, a journalist around 1900, a populist, a progressive. He wrote, I'm going to read it exactly. I could paraphrase it. I want to read it exactly. He wrote,
Absolutely.
"The price of liberty is something more than eternal vigilance. There must also be eternal advance. We can save the rights we have inherited from our fathers only by winning new ones to bequeath our children." I repeat that as often as I can to my students, and that is that you can't merely defend what you have. You have to constantly, because we're a grand experiment
Yeah,
in
defend
democracy.
what you love, right? You
Yeah, but
defend
we
what
also
you
have to
want to keep.
push. The only way to defend it is by enhancing it. Okay, that's the point of American history. You cannot defend. That's why this idea of a resistance is wonderful, but utterly inadequate. We
Yeah,
have to
it's
think.
just kind of getting you through the door, but not doing anything once you're in the door.
Well, I mean, frankly, the Clintonite resistors would be more than happy to return us to what it was before Trump. I mean, don't vote for Biden if you want to go back to the standard class war from above of the past 45 years. Don't vote for Biden if you want bipartisan politics that literally ignores the will of the people. Okay? I
Right.
mean, my point is that if you're going to defend the achievements of the revolution and the Civil War and the progressive years and FDR and the New Deal, then you build upon those achievements.
Right.
That's what Bernie understands. He doesn't say
And
let's have a new deal. He didn't say let's have a new deal. He said let's have a Green New Deal. He didn't say let's have the Economic Bill of Rights FDR spoke of. He said let's have a 21st century Economic Bill of Rights. He gets it.
right. And until you have a right, you don't know maybe what you are still missing. And when you're looking at a vast dream of something, you don't you kind of like imagine what that will be like, but until you've been offered parts of that dream, you don't recognize what other things that you may still need. So two of the other examples I had were, like when FDR pulled us out of the Depression, we still needed social justice. Yes, we had all of these social programs, but there were so many things more that needed to be touched upon that we didn't even know that we were missing until we started, talking about it and figuring out what was missing. Another example, like freedom of speech.
Let me respond to
Go ahead.
that because I'm gonna be your professor for a moment. Okay.
Okay.
I like the affection you expressed for FDR about pulling us out of the Depression, but FDR did not pull us out of the Great Depression. FDR rallied Americans
True.
and their labors and the Americans themselves by way of joining the Civilian Conservation Corps, joining up in the Works Progress Administration, in doing all of those things. That was fundamental. The labors we provided, number one, and number two, he empowered workers to organize labor unions, and millions of workers in all their diversity got organized in the 1930s into the 1940s. So it's not that FDR pulled us out; it's that Americans struggled against the Depression and against those who put us in the Depression, the corporate interests of the day.
So one of the things that that's a theme in a lot of your books is talking about how once out of this depression or once on better footing, that equality and economic prosperity and opportunities, they still weren't equal for everyone. There was a lot of people who benefited, and it saved lives. And I mean, that's undeniable, right? And it put our country back on a better track. But there was still groups of people that were kind of cut out from the American dream. Everybody's rallying and saying, look at our beautiful little, we have our 2.5 kids in our little house. And, now we have a union, and now we have, Social Security. So we have retirement, and we have all of these other programs that we didn't have that now keep us afloat and that keep us moving forward. But they didn't understand that wasn't the same for everyone. It was kind of like these gray people off on the end that just didn't really get to benefit. So that's kind of, I think where that social justice thing comes in, because that's kind of the fight that we're in now. We have to correct the things that we forgot the first time around. Another one of the examples that, to me, has been very prevalent in the last few years is we thought we had freedom of speech, right? We thought we had this, but it's been under such massive attack. If we just would have left it alone, in a year or two from now, we might not have anything at all. I mean, things like the Espionage Act and, not calling a whistleblower a spy and things like that have really, dissected our freedom of speech. And when we have a president who gets on Twitter every day and, threatens to sue people or, calls things fake news or makes veiled threats at the press in general. And when across the world we're seeing, journalists killed and free speech kind of, closed down, and we have countries where, the internet is shut down from certain things and they can't get messages in or out. Obviously, freedom of speech isn't exactly what we thought it was. It's like it's a right, but if we're not fighting for it, and if we're not keeping vigilant, and if we're not addressing these new issues as they come, especially with the internet, that's where the Espionage Act kind of rolled in with Obama. It became a major issue.
No. It's the U.S. Sorry, you're thinking of what? Are you thinking of the USA Patriot Act under Bush? Not Obama.
Well, wasn't espionage under Obama?
Well, there was an Espionage Act back in 1918 under Wilson.
Yeah, but didn't bring it forward? I mean, that's when we got into the Snowden thing and.
Oh,
Am
I
I
have no doubt.
mistaken?
Sorry, they didn't enact a new Espionage Act. My point
No,
is
he
that
just brought it
under
forward.
Bush, this is critical. Under Bush,
Okay.
there the Congress enacted the USA Patriot Act, which represented a threat in many ways to our freedoms. And there was only one no vote against it. That was by progressive senator from Wisconsin, Russ Feingold, who's no longer the senator. Now, by the way, and let's keep in mind that freedom of speech is also trampled upon when you think about the degree to which our airwaves, this is for decades, the networks were dominated by corporate interests. Okay, I mean, let's face it, and it really is the case that if you think about what's gone on these last number of months in the Democratic presidential campaign and the degree to which the major media have just literally either marginalized or denigrated Bernie Sanders, that to me is also troubling. If there isn't this kind of really critical, call it objective, but I would call it critical kind of media. And now, of course, the surprise is that despite all of that, Bernie is taking the lead in the Democratic campaign.
People
And
are still
I mean,
talking.
but I also want to say that we also have remarkable freedom of speech, although it doesn't match the scale of the corporate interest. The very fact that we have podcasters such as yourself, and we have online radio and online television, even by way of Hill TV Live and the Young Turks. I mean, we have a remarkable expression of freedom of speech. The tragedy is that the degree to which the corporate interests still control the major media
Monopolies now.
and really do limit freedom of speech.
Yeah, I read an article recently, and I don't know the exact numbers, but I remember they were staggering with how many news stations there were in the 60s and 70s across the country, and now how basically they're all owned by, just a few. So that, I mean, it's true. They're truly they're controlling the conversation when they're controlling the local levels to the national news across the entire country. That's, they have a lot of control. You think that we're hearing everything and you think that there's no slant, but they can, I mean, a small slant done far scale, I guess, or grand scale across many medias, it adds up to a lot of disinformation.
Well, think about the fact that it is almost impossible to get news of labor organizing and labor unions.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, and
Okay.
it's demonized.
Yeah.
It's made they're portrayed as rabble that want to create anarchy in the streets and want to just, they want everything for free, and they're just, you know, um, they're picking on their poor, you know, benevolent employers. I mean,
Well, all I
it's
can tell you is that I stopped watching, except for where there's no choice. I've stopped watching MSNBC and CNN because if they were supposedly the more objective and to whatever extent liberal news media, forget it. And I actually can tell you that now I do generally get my news from various online sources, and of course, reading various newspapers with a
yeah.
critical eye. And also, I oddly enough, for all of the supposed crap and BS that takes place on Twitter, it actually serves as quite a vehicle to find out what's going on, because news services actually do notify you on Twitter about breaking news, which in some cases is news that just doesn't get
Well,
covered
yeah,
on cable news.
it's taken on another life. I mean, me personally, I have always preferred to read my news and read it from a lot of different sources. So then I
Mhm.
can kind of look at it and see, okay, well, what's the truth in all of these? What is the common denominator that all of these? I feel that there's a lot of sensationalism with TV television news, because there's so much that can be done, the music and the lights and the video and the flash that really distract away from
Yeah.
things, and they control it. Where when you read, it's very hard to put the flash in there. I mean, obviously you can put it with words, but it's just not the same thing. So that's been my my personal lifesaver is to try to read as much as I can. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to finish this conversation.
Okay.
Awesome.
All over this country, a lot of bright, good people. They're saying, you know what? Situation is hopeless. If you can't beat the billionaires, you can't win. I'm giving up. That is exactly what they want us to believe. Do not enter that world of despair. Despair is not an option. Not just for you, but for your children and your grandchildren and for the future of this planet. Our job is to give people hope. The problems we face did not come down from the heavens. They are made by bad human decisions. And good human decisions can change them.
As powerful as the 1% and the corporate elite are, when the bottom 99% stands up and does not allow themselves to be divided up by Trump and his friends, there is nothing that will stop us.
Hi, welcome back to That's Jacqueline. So I pulled up some quotes out of your book while we were on the break that I thought was really interesting. And then we have some questions still from the audience that they want answered. So I thought I'd read this really fast. It's like a paragraph, so I apologize. And I'm not as a great orator. So fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down. In honor or dishonor to the latest generation, we say we are for the Union. The world will not forget that we say this. We know how to save the Union. The world knows we do know how to save it. We, even here, hold the power and bear the responsibility. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope. And I believe that was Lincoln. Is that right?
Absolutely.
So to me, you could take that quote and you could take out a few words and you could insert any of the battles that we're trying to fight for. I mean, it was so inspiring, and it just really stated it to me. It was literally like hearing Bernie, because he was saying it, he's saying it a little more poetically. Bernie's just like, here, let me just tell you. But it was like hearing him. He's telling you the problem. He's telling you that it's not a fight that we can step away from. We don't have that option, and that it's a valuable fight. My words are kind of tripping on themselves. But he's also saying that it's our responsibility. We cannot drop this ball, that this is not something. And I feel like that's something that Bernie does regularly, is he like you said, he inspires the fight in us. I mean, you say it regularly, and I love it, because that's really true. That's the one thing that I really like about Bernie Sanders, is that he inspires us each to do our part, and that's what a leader does. A leader, he tells you what needs to be done, and then he gives you reasons for why you should fight for it, and then he kind of steps out of the way and he lets you do it. And I think that that's one of the things that I really appreciate about Bernie early on, was other leaders are like, just let me handle it, I got this, and they just leave it at that, and they want you to trust them to do it their way and that they're going to do it right. And we've seen this with president after president. They come in on a boatload of promises, and then they kind of just drop them at the White House door. And that and we're lucky if maybe one or two have been picked up, and possibly they have done something about those promises. But what we find, I think, or what we have gotten used to and accustomed to, is like, oh, well, there's only so much he can do. And that's true. There is only so much they can do. But we've become accustomed to, here's your 20 promises. If you give us half of one of them, we're okay with that. You're still our guy. We'll vote for you the next election, and you can come back and maybe hopefully accomplish the other half. But I think that's become a big problem. And Bernie says, no, we're going to all do this together. He inspires people across the nation, not just the people, but other politicians, to do their part where they stand. And he creates a solid foundation across America, versus just fighting things on the federal level. He's encouraging people to fight them on the local level, and he's encouraging us to take to the streets if need to be heard. So that's kind of what I got out of this. I know it's maybe a slight leap, but kind of what came to my mind. What do you have any other thoughts to add to that particular
Well,
quote.
the main thing, the reason I use that quote, and I opened the book with the story of Lincoln giving that speech, is it's December 1862. The United States is torn apart by a civil war. He's having to lead the Union forces, you might say, to hold the Union together. And what he's basically telling Americans, because he's about to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, is, look, we all know what this war is really about, and we all know what we need to do. We need to bring an end to slavery. And we need to bring it into slavery in order to basically end the divided house, the North free, the South slave. And in essence, what he's saying is, look, the Declaration offered a promise, as I said when we spoke earlier. It offered a promise: equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the fact is that we need to act radically to bring an end to those kinds of things, slavery most of all, which has divided us and stands in the way of the American promise. But there's another aspect to that, and that is he makes it very clear in that quote that we don't do this for the slaves alone. We do it for ourselves, okay?
Right.
Because basically, what would have kept slavery from including elements of the white population? What would have,
And it has kind of in some cases. I mean, there's been, throughout history, there's been different forms of slavery. And if you look at the prison population, that's a form of slavery when you're imprisoning people for small offenses for half their life, and then you're having them work for 3 cents, an hour for a big corporation that just happens to fund the politician that, enacted the laws that got them there in the first place. So I mean, it is there's still, it's always, these things are always going to be a fight. This is one of the things I raised my children on, is that you're still going to fight these things. There's nothing just promised that you get to keep. And throughout your life, the things that you want to keep and the good things in your life, you're going to have to keep fighting for them, or they're going to slip away. And I think that as a nation, we think, well, we're the great United States of America, and we've already done these fights, and we're better than everyone else, and we're just, and we're honest, and we're moral. All these things that, this red, white, and blue anthems, playing in their head of all the things that they think that just because they were born in the United States, they have, and that everybody else has in equal measure. And that's just not true. Those things it's like the rule book, but it's our job to enforce the rule book, and it's our job to make like you said, to enhance the rule book. It's our job to make sure that we're keeping up with the times and that we're keeping up with problems as they arise. So sorry to cut you off, but that was just kind of a thought I had on it.
That's okay.
So I had another quote, and you'll have to tell me again who it is because you know this, but it's what do you mean by, so I wanted to know what you meant by, but I believe the quote is by someone else. It is later than you think, the need for a militant democracy.
Okay, it is actually the title of a book.
Okay, I did not know that.
Yes, as I said, because I actually say in the first part of the book that if I could have stolen the title of a book from someone else, it would have been that title.
That's right. I remember it was a title that you wanted, but I somehow missed that you had. Yeah.
Max Lerner was a really great social critic, political critic, and intellectual of the 1930s and 40s. He lives on for, in later years, and he moves from being a sort of socialist to becoming a liberal, and then he even has conservative tendencies. But that's not the point. Back in the 1930s and 40s, he's writing as a radical. And his argument is that as fascism is spreading in Europe and is threatening the United States, it is imperative that the United States not simply defend itself and defend democracy, but literally represent an example of enhancing democracy. So when he says, it is later than you think, the need for militant democracy, says we ought not to wait until that moment when we come under attack, either overseas or, for that matter, in the United States. Don't forget, the southern states really did practice their own form of fascism. It was white supremacy, Jim Crow, apartheid, segregation. And the fact,
rearing its ugly head again.
And the fact is, he said that it's imperative that we address these kinds of inequalities and injustices, the need for a militant democracy. So I love the title, and I love
that militant democracy thing. It just says so much.
Yeah.
to me, that was really interesting. I have a couple of questions here. So this question came on Twitter. It's from the War Against Truth. I think I mentioned this, but they're a band. They're a political band, and I just absolutely love them. And every member just has such
I gotta fix the
interesting.
chair.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Has such interesting comments every week, and I really enjoy the conversations I have with them. So this was a three-part question they had. So it said, Professor, since history always repeats itself, what parallels in American history do you see in our current political landscape? So we'll start with that part of the question. So what parallels in American history do you see in our current political landscape?
Well, let me start off by saying, and I'm sure that War Against Truth is a fabulous band, but I have to say, history does not repeat itself. Okay, in fact, I remember one of my daughter's school teachers made the remark, "History repeats itself," and I actually went in and berated him for saying such things, because if people believe that history repeats itself, then it makes them inactive. It makes them sit back, because either you believe, well, if history is going to repeat itself, why bother to do anything? Or even if you think history might be good, you say, well, why bother to make anything better?
Like,
Because
I don't want to do
just
the
wait
laundry
around,
because
it'll happen all by itself.
Again.
Yeah, and I really seriously, that's a line, that history repeats itself, that pisses me off more than anything. However, I do understand what they're getting. I do understand what they're getting at, and I think what they're concerned about is, how do we keep a Sanders administration from falling into the same kind of routine that
was
other
the next part of
administrations?
the question. So it was,
Yes.
How do we avoid repeating past mistakes when Bernie is elected? So
Well, it's interesting. I believe there's a book coming out this spring which actually says, well, what do we do after the Sanders election? And that's in many ways what the question, or Sanders' victory, the question is asking. Look, Bernie said, not me, us. And he meant that because he said there's an agenda to be pursued that requires Americans to be mobilized and organized, alert and ready to act, to express themselves. And he didn't mean that only, he doesn't mean not me, us in terms of getting elected. He means not me, us in terms of his own presidency. And probably he'd be the first to say that if he starts falling into line in the same way that Obama did, in terms of,
do something about it.
that you folks should do something about it. So look, I don't just mean get out in the streets. It's more than that. I mean, people need to be organized. They're organize a union in the workplace.
Right.
Be organized. Join the Democratic Party, even locally. Don't let the Democrats locally get away with what they often get away with. I remember back in the 2000s that I was invited to join the Democratic Party here in Brown County, Wisconsin, and I was asked to be on their ideas committee, right? Because I'm a professor.
Because you have ideas, Harvey.
Yeah, right. And all I remember the frustration of being the only sort of left Democrat in this crowd. They were all sort of Clinton types. And so I thought to myself, this is inadequate. More and more people on the left. I know that the idea of joining the Democratic Party is ridiculous, but you can join DSA and the Democratic Party. You don't have to accept the Democrats the way they are. So, I think it's important to be organized. I think women's organizations, join them and make sure that they stand for women's right to control their own bodies, and also women's rights in the workplace. Join organizations that are liberal, progressive, and make them all the more liberal and progressive.
So these organizations, because you're taking it from a standpoint of like, join them and then do something. But one of the things that I think is really important is the information and the education you get in these organizations. When people come to me and they say, hey, do you want to come to this meeting? Or, hey, do you want to check this out? I always say yes, because I want to hear what's being talked about. I want to learn something new. And those kinds of organizations, that's where you get these new ideas that are just, that open up your mind and show you a problem that maybe you didn't see, or show you a solution that maybe you didn't see, that maybe it's very simple, but people aren't hearing about, because there's only so much that can be discussed on the national level. There's about 10,000 other issues underneath them in your individual community. There are things that are going wrong that really isn't the president's problem to fix. It's the people's problems to fix. And if you do not stopgap these problems where they stand, then they become a national problem. Then they spread to the county next door and to throughout the state, and then it's several states, and then the president has to identify, things like racism, problems with like freedom of speech, those kind of things. If you don't stop them when you see them, wherever you see them, those kind of things become national problems and real issues.
Yeah, another thing, wait, there's another thing I think is really important, and it's the argument I make, especially at the close of the book, based on the arguments throughout the book, and that is that we have to learn that this is a fight not only for freedom, equality, and democracy. This is also a fight about solidarity. The powers that be love to divide us.
Right.
They love to have us believe, for example, that civil rights is only for African Americans, or somehow when we say the word working class, we're only talking about whites and not people who are black or brown. The fact is that we have to start seeing each other as fellow Americans.
Right.
Okay? And we need to create a narrative, and that's another theme of the book. We need to create a narrative in which we understand that if we talk about the struggle against slavery, it's a struggle against slavery that was our story, and not only the story of African Americans. So we need to know that civil rights struggles of the 60s were a story that belonged to all of us.
Everybody. So Bernie says that he says this in a lot of his rallies is I want you to look at the guy next to you, or the guy you don't see here. Would you fight for him? Would you be willing to fight? So, I mean, there's definitely a sense of like, a brotherhood, sisterhood in that movement. There was a third part about this, this part of this question. It says, how can we make a Green New Deal permanent? And this to me is just like that was like mic drop. I was like, oh, we need to have that question in there, because I feel I know that there's this Republican idea that the Green New Deal is just about the climate, or it's just about this. I don't think that a lot of voters on that side of the argument really understand what it means, because it has green in there. They've started to think it's something different. They don't understand what the New Deal was to begin with, and that it's just basically what's the word, an enhancement, like you say, to the original New Deal, right? So maybe you can kind of explain, because I think that I will have people who see this video on both sides. So I'd like them to understand what the Green New Deal is from somebody, I think, who has a better understanding of what the New Deal was to begin with. And then, your ideas on what you think, how could we create
well, let me just start off. Look, the New Deal was a massive mobilization of American energies and resources in order, indeed, to get people jobs, to start creating a decent American standard of living for all, and basically, to keep people from hitting the road as what, we used to call hobos, traveling the rails and stuff. I mean, I don't think people realize just how devastating the Depression of the 30s was. And the way to address it was not top down. It had to be a struggle that took place not only presidentially and legislatively, but also from the bottom up. But it really did involve providing, I mean, the New Deal included not only giving people make work jobs, but really productive jobs, creation of parks, fighting soil erosion, planting new forests, fighting the drought that struck, and the Dust Bowl.
All things that create jobs, right?
I mean, on and on and on. I mean, it was all of these things. And it really did, by the way, provide work-study opportunities for students. I mean, it was massive. It also vastly improved, radically improved the environment. So in many ways, the Green New Deal is right in the New Deal tradition. Okay, now, the Green New Deal is to say, the only reason the Green New Deal even comes up on the agenda is the grand tragedy and grand threat that our planet is in trouble. We have, for just too long, ignored the devastation being wrought by the various forces that create the greenhouse gases. I mean, we're in trouble. I mean, we're in trouble. Look what happened in Australia. Look what's been happening out west. Look at the hurricanes and the devastation that they've been wreaking on American life. And then think about this going on in Africa. I mean, sorry, I'm sorry. This is you asked me to do this, and I want to make it clear that there's a crisis. And the Green New Deal is not just let's all be nice and not throw litter on the ground, or let's all be nice and re-insulate our homes in order to save energy. It is a matter of mobilizing American energies and addressing, as an example to the world, this problem of global planetary climate crisis. So the Green New Deal is not just simply a matter of some new initiatives. It's a matter of transforming in a radical fashion the ways in which we live, but doing it not so we'll be living poorly, so that we'll be living better lives.
Yeah, so I think their question was a little, I mean, the permanent part is a little bit vague, but if these platforms, if we create, if we can start this from the bottom up, like you talked about, and if we create programs that become part of, part of the social programs and things that we already have, if we do this on a federal level, then I think that does make them permanent. I mean, there was a huge argument, and in your first book, it really laid it out about how many of these programs seemed ridiculous. People like Social Security, are you kidding? And there was a time that public education paid for by tax dollars was considered like crazy. And Medicare, what are you talking about? Like that's not, there's so many programs.
It's not that they were considered crazy. It's that the powers that be thought they were a threat. You don't want to give working people the ability to read and write. You don't want to give working people the chance to actually stop working. I mean, the corporate interests literally feared Social Security, and they even feared public education. Look, I remember I gave a talk in a library about FDR and the Four Freedoms back around 2015. I was in New Jersey giving this talk, and before I gave the talk, I was just reading things on the wall. There were framed pictures of this, and there was a framed newspaper article in which the leading businessman of that town back in the 19-teens or whenever said he didn't think they should have to build a library. It only creates problems. People are going to start reading books they shouldn't be reading. Right. See what I'm getting at?
Then you got to burn the books, and that's just like such a hassle. So, Bernie Sanders obviously is a great he's a great driving force in the Green New Deal. There's some other
AOC yes. And Senator, I guess it was Markey or the senator from Massachusetts. Is that Markey or Merkel? I'm forgetting. I confused.
Yeah.
But those two were the ones who really launched in bill form the Green New Deal. Right. But Bernie had really been placing it on the agenda for some time. So it really is not just Bernie. It's literally progressive Democrats.
No, and it's a partnership, definitely. It comes back to the not me, us, really, truly. But I'm just saying he's been a huge supporter of it, and he's made it common.
Proponent is the word you're looking for.
Proponent. Yes, that is the word actually. So and he's pushed this along. One of the things we've seen this last week is these attacks coming from all angles, from every major candidate that is or ever has been being the key operative term here, come forward and make attacks. And I truly believe it's because they can't get him on the policies. His policies are sound. The people support his policies. Even people who aren't wanting to vote for him still admit that they like his policies. I mean, it's kind of hard to, to say Medicare for all is a bad thing. It's kind of hard to say that, taking care of, making sure that we shore up Social Security, making it untouchable is unpopular. These are all things.
Look, if Trump should follow through on his recent threat to cut into Social Security, I think Americans should take to the streets.
Oh, I do think so.
I think they should take to the streets in anger. And there's no effing way that Americans should allow Social Security. It's bad enough what we allowed Clinton to do with aid to family with dependent children. No way can we allow this kind of stuff to happen.
Well, no, and I mean, and it's interesting that they would even suggest this when we have this mass population of seniors that are on the program, and we know
mass population of people they guaranteed if he goes to cut it, it will not affect those who are on it. It will affect those who are not yet on it.
Yeah, but who've already been paying on it and who have
because Social Security is not a government program, and people need to understand this and get pissed off about this. It's not a government program. It's our program. It's American working people's insurance program. It's not a state program.
So we're almost done on time, but I had a personal question, well, no, I guess not personal question, but just in general, what is the one policy that you most are, because I mean, obviously you're a Bernie supporter, I'm a Bernie supporter, so I know this. But what is the policy to you that is like that we just cannot live without, of Bernie's, that we just cannot live without? What is,
Okay.
if you had to pick one?
We can't live without the Green New Deal. That's a life-threatening thing. But in the meantime, as we go forward, I believe it is absolutely essential that the Democrats and Bernie Sanders move quickly to empower workers to organize.
True.
The only way that you're going to enable progressive Democratic Party advancement and policies to be enacted and capital to be contained and whittled away at in terms of the power that they have is if workers are organized. The reason we are in the crisis we are in terms of inequality in particular has to do with the fact that in 1947, when the Republicans had control of Congress, they enacted a Taft-Hartley law, which really did disable unions from organizing in the South. And that meant that even in the 1960s, that it divided blacks and whites on questions of civil rights and union rights. And then in the 1970s, when we were finally starting to get it all together, big business, corporate interests, and the Republicans, with too often Democratic deference, declared war on labor. And once upon a time in 1955, 1 of every 3 workers was in a union, and now it's under 1 in 10. You don't have unions, the Democratic Party is doomed. You don't have unions, inequality will increase all the more, and
Right.
We'll see this utter concentration of power and wealth all the more. I mean, I can tell you, look, I'm 70 years old now, and in the 1970s, as bad as they were, inequality was nothing like it's become today. And this is a consequence of the smashing of labor unions.
Yeah, and it's kind of a tale as old as time, right? I mean, you've had kings and you've had lords and serfs, and this has always been a thing. Anytime that divide becomes so vast, when there's like a canyon between the haves and the have-nots, this becomes an issue. I mean, you made an excellent point earlier on that, something that I agree with, that that when you're fighting for survival, these weren't your exact words, but when you're fighting for survival, you don't have time for much else. And so the way that the haves keep in power is making sure that you're constantly a have not, and that you don't have the resources, you don't have the time, you don't have the money, or the strength in some cases to really take to the streets, to call your senators, to, vote. There's all kinds of reasons, why that happens. But I do agree that the unions are a really big part of that, is making sure that, workers have rights. I have an episode coming up, and I think I want to have you patched in for it, about unions and about, some of the struggles throughout, American history, and what, kind of like the roller coaster that unions have been on. And the one thing that came up when I was doing my research for it is just how much the Republican Party has tried to demonize unions, have tried to make it. I mean, there's so much to go on about it, but yeah, I appreciate that. Is there anything else you want to leave us with, Harvey? Because I know you and I could talk for forever, but you just have always been.
Look, I mean, all I can tell you is I have watched Bernie Sanders since the early 1980s. And I remember thinking to myself back then, wow, it'd be great if someday I get to vote for a political candidate like Bernie Sanders. And there we were in 2015-16. And I thought, oh, Jesus, here's the chance. In the primaries, I voted for Bernie Sanders, and he won Wisconsin, even though he lost the nomination. But what's really crucial here is this. Bernie Sanders is an even better candidate now than he was in 2016.
Oh, for
He's
sure.
a better candidate, not only because of the policies he's pushing, but Bernie Sanders himself, during this particular campaign cycle, has himself taken hold of history. He has literally grabbed hold of the FDR legacy. He has talked about such things as workers' democracy, such as which in FDR's day was industrial democracy. He wants to redeem the promise of the New Deal and give it a new advance by way of a Green New Deal. He believes that it's imperative to enact an economic Bill of Rights that FDR proposed, and he has added to that by way of a 21st century economic Bill of Rights. I can't emphasize it strongly enough. If you're a progressive and you want to see social democratic advancement, you must not fail to back Bernie if you can afford to with a donation, and then make sure you get out to vote and talk to all of your friends and family and get them to vote for Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, he's definitely a dream candidate. I'm really hoping that we are able to see him in there this time, and that there's no hindrances to that. So I'm gonna just kind of close there. Again, here's Harvey J. Kaye, Take Hold of Our History. Thank you so much, Harvey, for coming.
Thank you, Jacqueline. As I said, it's good to see you again.
You too, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.